Can contraception ever be morally permissible? As we've seen, Catholic teaching answers this in the negative. But now, let's take a closer look at arguments for and against. We'll begin once again with the philosophical level. As we've seen, the Church says that we can appreciate using our reason alone that freely chosen sexual activity must be fully unitive and fully procreative. Therefore, the Church concludes, we can see, using our reason alone, that contraception is morally wrong. Others disagree. They might say, for example, that it's not necessary for each and every instance of freely chosen sex to be fully procreative to be moral. Rather, they claim that as long as the marriage on the whole is open to procreation, it's okay to use contraception in certain instances. How might a Catholic who upholds Church teaching respond? Well, you could argue, as does Catholic bioethicist Nicanor Austriaco, that we cannot dismiss individual acts like that, since they are very morally significant. Each act we engage in shapes us and helps us either toward or away from eternal happiness. So just as a single act of stealing or adultery is morally wrong, so too is a single act of contraception, Austriaco says. A related line of attack against Church teaching is to argue that the Church itself thinks that it's okay for sex to not be fully procreative, since it permits the use of NFP and having sex only during infertile times in order to avoid pregnancy. In response, as we already started to see earlier, while the intention of contraception and NFP are indeed the same, to avoid pregnancy, the objects, what is being done, are different. According to John Paul II, the couple who uses NFP respects the procreative meaning of human sexuality, acting as ministers of God's plan, and they benefit from their sexuality according to the original dynamism of total self-giving. One might add that the couple still remains open to a child if the method does not work. On the other hand, the Pope claims, in the case of contraception, the couple acts as arbiters of the divine plan, manipulating and degrading human sexuality, and with it themselves and their married partner by altering its value of total self-giving. The conclusion of this line of reasoning is that couples who use NFP do have sex that is fully unitive and procreative, whereas couples who use contraception engage in sex that is neither fully unitive nor procreative. Keep in mind, too, that the Catechism states that natural family planning methods respect the bodies of the spouses and encourage tenderness. What the Catechism is hinting at here is that the use of natural family planning is not just the right thing to do, but is also in our own interests. It has no harmful side effects, like certain forms of contraception, and the period of abstinence that NFP methods require can actually benefit marital relationships by facilitating communication between the spouses and creating a kind of courtship honeymoon effect. There have been a number of recent studies that confirm these benefits, pointing to the fact that the moral use of NFP has led many to a greater happiness. Again, the idea is that all of this can be appreciated using our reason alone. But once again, Christians will want to know what, if anything, the Bible has to say about these issues, of course. The book of Genesis exhorts humans to be fruitful and multiply, which some take as implicitly frowning upon a contraceptive mentality. But does the Bible directly address contraception? Well, many have claimed that one passage does. In Genesis 38, a man named Judah has two sons, the older son, and Onan. Marries Tamar, but then displeases God, the text doesn't say why exactly, and God kills him. Now, according to something called the Law of Levirate, Onan now has the duty to marry Tamar in order to preserve his brother's line, such that any children that Onan and Tamar had would be considered heirs of Onan engaged in sexual relations with Tamar, but since Onan knew any resulting child would not be legally his, he spilled his seed on the ground, what we would call coitus interruptus today. God gets mad at Onan and takes his life too. Now, here's the key question. Why exactly did God get mad at Onan? There's two possibilities here. One is that God didn't like that Onan refused to obey the law of Levirate and have children for his brother. That's the dominant biblical interpretation today, which says that this passage doesn't have anything to do with contraception. However, the long-standing traditional explanation was that God got angry at Onan because he spilled his seed, in other words, engaged in a sort of contraception. In support of this idea, some have noted that Scripture elsewhere, Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 9 to 10, treats the violation of the law of levirate as a fairly minor offense. In any case, in the end, Christians should take into account that there are certainly no direct biblical arguments in favor of contraception, and one potential direct biblical argument against it. As an interesting side note, by the way, Onan has been immortalized in our language through the term onanism, which can refer either to coitus interruptus or to masturbation. Moving right along, as we've seen, Catholics and many other Christians will be interested in not just what the Bible says on a particular issue, but also tradition. Would you say 2,000 years of church tradition has more or less approved of contraception, or has it been opposed? The answer is that it's been very strongly opposed since the earliest centuries of the Church. In particular, many well-known theologians, both Catholic, Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, and non-Catholic, Martin Luther and John Calvin, have firmly condemned contraception. In fact, it wasn't until 1930 that for the first time a major Christian body, the Anglicans, acknowledged at the Lambeth Conference that contraception might be moral, and then only in limited circumstances. Now, of course, opponents of church teaching will claim that this tradition should change, since it is of men, not of God. On the other hand, Catholics who support church teaching believe that God speaks to us through tradition on this issue, and others, and that the continuous opposition of tradition to contraception is a clear sign of God's will. Finally, Catholics in particular will be interested not just in philosophical arguments and arguments at the level of Scripture and tradition, but also arguments at what we can call the magisterial level. One issue is whether the Church has infallibly, in other words, without error, proclaimed against contraception. Some, like theologian John Kipley, think that repeated Church condemnations of contraception throughout history, both by popes in Humanae Vitae and otherwise, and bishops, have been so authoritative and definitive that they rise to the level of an infallible teaching that cannot possibly be wrong. But Kipley adds that even if the condemnation of contraception was not technically proclaimed infallibly, ex cathedra from the throne, it has been still taught in a sufficiently formal and consistent way, such that Catholics should follow it with religious submission of mind and will. Another common argument on this magisterial level is that the sense of the faithful, which as we saw is said to complement the magisterium, indicates that the use of contraception is morally permissible. More specifically, the argument goes, since the universal sense of the faithful is infallible, and since most married Catholics use contraception and don't have a problem with it, it must be okay. But remember that according to Catholic teaching, the faithful are those who let their views be formed more by the gospel than by contemporary culture, and who do not disagree with the Pope and bishops. Catholics who support church teaching on contraception maintain that those who disagree with this teaching are not on the same page as the Pope and bishops, and are letting their views be influenced more by contemporary culture, and that even if they're well-intentioned, they do not count as the faithful for the purposes of the sense of the faithful. Therefore, the argument goes, those who disagree with this teaching are not infallible on this issue after all. In other words, just because many Catholics and other Christians are okay with contraception, that does not mean that it is morally right. Let's turn to some issues regarding the achievement of pregnancy, beginning, once again, with natural family planning. As we saw above, natural family planning can be used not just to avoid pregnancy, but also to achieve it by having sex during the fertile days. Catholic teaching would permit NFP's use for this, indeed even encourage it, assuming the spouses are exercising responsible parenthood. In other words, that they're physically and emotionally ready to care for the child. Forms of assisted reproduction. Sometimes natural methods don't work in achieving pregnancy, and you need some outside assistance. As a general rule, the Catechism states that research aimed at reducing human sterility is to be encouraged, on condition that it is placed at the service of the human person, of his inalienable rights, and his true and integral good according to the design and will of God. In other words, assisted reproduction is allowed as long as it respects human dignity. Let's now turn to what the Church says about specific forms of assisted reproduction. We'll begin with fertility drugs. Fertility drugs hyperstimulate a woman's ovaries in order to help her produce an egg and conceive. This would certainly be morally permissible, as long as the stimulation is controlled in order to prevent multifetal pregnancy, which would pose risks to the mother and the unborn children. Next, in vitro fertilization, or IVF for short. There are also many laboratory technologies today that can be used to help spouses conceive a child if they are having difficulty doing so on their own. One of the most common ones is in vitro fertilization. In this procedure, the man's sperm and the woman's eggs are mixed together in a petri dish. At least one of the resulting embryos is then transferred to the woman's uterus so that it might grow to term. The other embryos are then either frozen for future use or thrown away. This can be done either in a homologous way, that just involves the husband and wife, or a heterologous way, involving a third-party donor. The Church has at least a few problems with this procedure. First, it always involves a violation of one of the rules we discussed earlier. In other words, it involves procreation that is separated from sexual union. In the words of the Catechism, the act which brings the child into existence is no longer an act by which two persons give themselves to one another, but one that entrusts the life and identity of the embryo into the power of doctors and biologists and establishes the domination of technology over the origin and destiny of the human person. Such a relationship of domination is in itself contrary to the dignity and equality that must be common to parents and children. Second, generally speaking, more than one egg is harvested and fertilized in order to maximize the success of the procedure. Unless all of these are implanted in the woman at once, which itself poses health risks to the resulting children, some will be frozen or discarded. The Church has a problem with both of these options. Freezing an embryo is considered a violation of its dignity, and discarding an embryo the moral equivalent of abortion. Third, generally speaking, the way that sperm is harvested from the male is through masturbation, which, as we already saw, the Church is opposed to. Fourth, in the case of heterologous IVF, the Church has additional problems. The Catechism suggests this practice involves a further violation of the child's dignity, that it infringes the child's right to be born of a mother and father known to him and bound to each other by marriage, and furthermore, that heterologous IVF betrays the spouse's right to become a father and a mother only through each other. This last statement seems to be just another way of saying that heterologous IVF violates the requirement of marital fidelity. Let's turn to another procedure, zygote intrafallopian tube transfer, or ZIFT for short. This procedure is similar to IVF, except that some or all of the embryos are transferred to the woman's fallopian tube instead of her uterus. The Church has the same moral problems with this procedure as with IVF, and also prohibits it under all circumstances. Next, intracytoplasmic sperm injection, ICSI. Here, a doctor uses a tiny pipette to insert one sperm into each egg, and then places the fertilized eggs in the mother's fallopian tube or uterus. The Church objects to this procedure for the same reasons it objects to IVF and ZIFT, and prohibits it under all circumstances. Finally, we have gamete intrafallopian transfer, or GIFT. In this procedure, the man's sperm is retrieved in one of two ways: masturbation, or sex with a perforated condom. The woman's egg is also retrieved, and then both egg and sperm are placed into a catheter with an air bubble between them to prevent fertilization. The egg and sperm are then inserted into the woman's fallopian tube, and the sperm and egg are released there so that fertilization might occur inside the woman. That's the key difference when it comes to this procedure compared to the previous ones. Okay, so is this morally permissible? Well, the magisterium has not officially pronounced a judgment on this procedure, and it's currently disputed among individual Catholic moral theologians. Some say that as long as a perforated condom is used, and as long as the spouses are married to begin with, this procedure is morally permissible since it can happen shortly after the sex act, and therefore is procreation that is not really separate from sexual union. Other theologians think that the act of procreation is too detached from the sexual union for this procedure to be morally licit. From a Catholic perspective, couples deciding whether or not to engage in gift ought to utilize the virtue of prudence and follow a conscience informed by prayer and study of the opposing arguments. Okay, so we've emerged from our alphabet soup and can turn to surrogate motherhood. What's a surrogate mother? Well, sometimes you can have one of the aforementioned lab procedures and then transfer the resulting embryo to a surrogate mother. A surrogate mother is someone who carries a child to term for another couple. She may or may not be genetically related to the child. The Catechism opposes this particular procedure, which it says entails the dissociation of husband and wife by the intrusion of a person other than the couple. In other words, the claim is that surrogate motherhood violates the marital fidelity requirement. Catholic teaching adds that it offends the dignity and the right of the child to be conceived, carried in the womb, brought into the world, and brought up by his own parents. Next, we take a look at the reproductive cloning of humans. Through a procedure called somatic cell nuclear transfer, an animal or even a human could theoretically be cloned by inserting the nucleus of one of his or her body cells into an egg whose nucleus has been removed. The egg is then stimulated with a shock and begins to develop as a clone of the original animal or human who provided the nucleus. While a sheep named Dolly was cloned in this way as early as 1997, presently there's no definitive evidence of a cloned human being brought to term. And so, unlike the other forms of assisted reproduction we've discussed, this one appears to be purely theoretical at this point, and doesn't even involve male and female gametes. In any case, even if it were possible to clone humans in this way, it would always be morally prohibited by the Church. More specifically, here we have procreation that is separate from sexual union, a violation of one of those rules I mentioned earlier. Catholic teaching adds that we have an especially strong violation of the dignity of the resulting human that is produced. This would impose on the resulting individual a predetermined genetic identity, subjecting him, as has been stated, to a form of biological slavery, from which it would be difficult to free himself. In other words, the clone would be subject to unfair expectations to live up to the standard of the person he or she was cloned from. Overall, as we have seen, the Church prohibits most of the aforementioned procedures under all circumstances. However, we should add that the Catechism does acknowledge the grave difficulties that sterile couples can face and encourages them to bring some good out of these. It says, "The Gospel shows that physical sterility is not an absolute evil. Spouses who still suffer from infertility after exhausting legitimate medical procedures should unite themselves with the Lord's cross, the source of all spiritual fecundity. They can give expression to their generosity by adopting abandoned children or performing demanding services for others." And that brings us to the issue of adoption. As I just suggested, the Church not only permits but also encourages adoption. It considers adoption to be a self-giving act of the theological virtue of charity or love. While such a situation may not be perfectly ideal, and that a child is raised by parents other than his or her own, there is no violation at all of the rule that procreation must not be separate from sexual union, since the child's already been born. Last but not least, the adoption of abandoned human embryos. As I mentioned earlier, spare embryos produced by procedures such as IVF are often frozen indefinitely. Believe it or not, right now there are hundreds of thousands of frozen embryos in fertility clinics across the United States. Would it be morally permissible for a couple unrelated to one of these embryos to adopt or rescue it by bringing it to term? Some Christian organizations, such as the Snowflakes program, tries to help facilitate this. The Catholic Church has not officially pronounced on this issue as of yet, and it is currently disputed among individual Catholic moral theologians. Everyone agrees that the intention here is good, saving the baby. However, the dispute appears to be over whether the object is morally good or bad. What do you suppose the object is? Some think the object is simply transferring the embryo from the freezer to the womb, or something in those terms, which would be morally good, and therefore they say the entire act is good. However, others suggest that part of the object involves the doctor making the woman pregnant, and therefore the very violation of the marital covenant and marital fidelity, since the couple has a right to become pregnant only through each other. These theologians would say that the object is morally bad, and that therefore the entire act is bad. Until the Catholic Church pronounces on this issue, once again, Catholics are free to make their decision about it using the virtue of prudence and an informed conscience. Well, thanks for joining me for this lecture series on the Sixth Commandment and Catholic sexual ethics. I hope I've answered the questions you've had and also given you some additional issues to think about.